Well, good morning, DDP. It's nice to be back here in Tucson with all of you, and I want to thank Jane and Jeremy and Adrian and the rest of their team for making this another resounding success. Let me begin by sharing. Let's make sure I've got this. I understand how I'm working this thing. Okay, here we go. Let me begin by sharing a fascinating study from UCLA and Harvard. Researchers there found that 97.6% of crows killed by vehicles along our roads and highways were killed by trucks. Even more amazing, they figured out why this is happening. It seems the crows post sentries that warn their flock mates of approaching vehicles. And every time the sentries see an oncoming car, they cry out, "Car, car, car!" But they never figured out how to screech, "Truck, truck, truck!" Yeah, you're laughing, but this is a serious problem. And I'm not talking about the poor dead carrion-eating crows. I'm talking about the slipshod, phony pseudoscience that we're dealing with almost every day. It's going on for decades, and it's not just in climate change, it's all across the board. Or to employ a more agricultural term in this agricultural talk, I'm talking about BS, cow manure studies, that have increasingly become the foundation for our laws, our policies, our regulations, and even our court decisions. The slipshod, phony science is just out of control at this point. And instead of real science, solid real-world evidence, and rigorous analysis, especially on climate and energy and agricultural issues, they're producing sloppy, agenda-driven, fraudulent research that relies on bogus computer models and projections, falsifies and manipulates data, concocts evidence, and rushes to publish press releases about their studies before anyone has a chance to conduct real, honest, third-party peer reviews of their work. And then the researchers and their activist media and political allies go into overdrive to censor, intimidate, and silence anyone who dares to question or criticize the suspect science or the heavy-handed, destructive policies and laws that result from it. On top of that, we have eco-activists, legislators, regulators, judges, journalists, and even presidents who've become unable or unwilling to talk, think, or govern beyond slogans and calls to action. So they say, stop oil, carbon pollution poisons our planet, climate change is an existential threat, eat clean, green, organic, good for nature, good for you, ban GMO frankenfoods, I'm not a GMO lab rat. They apparently believe declaring ecological emergencies, repeating clever mantras, and issuing proclamations and mandates will create a fossil fuel-free organic farming utopia in their dreams. Meanwhile, here in the real world, since 1950, American farmers have increased per acre corn yields by an incredible 500%, and other crop yields by smaller but still amazing amounts, while using less land, water, fuel, fertilizers, and pesticides. Their exports helped slash global malnutrition and hunger. Farmers in Brazil and India and other countries worldwide have likewise enjoyed record harvests of many kinds in recent years. And all these records and successes have multiple roots. Hybrid seeds combine the valuable traits from different related plants. Biotech seeds genetically engineer multiple valuable traits into plants to protect crops against insects and viruses and reduce water and pesticide requirements. Nitrogen fertilizers, synthesized from natural gas, join phosphorus and potassium in supercharging soils. Schools and online programs offer libraries of agricultural success tools. The internet provides the world's entire library of information literally at people's fingertips. Warmer weather and increased atmospheric carbon dioxide or CO2 spur plant growth even further. Long-lasting herbicides control weeds that would otherwise steal moisture and nutrients from crops while enabling farmers to utilize no-till farming methods that avoid breaking up soils. They reduce erosion, retain moisture, and preserve vital soil organisms. And for those of you who might still be terrified about the climate crisis, no-till farming also sequesters planet-threatening CO2 in the soils. That's important. Drip irrigation, developed by Israeli farmers and entrepreneurs, delivers water precisely where it's needed without the evaporation that's characteristic of so many other irrigation methods. Israeli developed systems also turn seawater into fresh water for drinking and turn used household and other wastewater into water that's good enough for irrigation. Modern high-tech tractors use GPS systems, sensors, cameras, and other equipment to steer precise courses across fields while constantly measuring soil composition and injecting just the right kinds and amounts of fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides, along with seeds to ensure optimal harvests. You could say tractors have grown up from toddlers to NFL linemen. They've gone from 27 horsepower Fordson major tractors on steel wheels and tank-like tracks in 1950 to the medium-sized 100 horsepower John Deere and Massey Ferguson and Mahindra tractors that we're used to seeing these days, and even to 500 horsepower behemoths that can serve the needs of even the largest farms. So try to imagine the bounteous crops that we could provide to all humanity if we could spread these technologies worldwide. And imagine the malnutrition, disease, and death we could minimize or prevent. But unfortunately, instead of that, this planet-saving, life-saving progress is under assault by well-intended but ill-informed masses who are indoctrinated and led by ill-intended but well-informed ideologues. They're well-funded, highly organized, and determined to ban man-made fertilizers and other modern agricultural methods and technologies. They claim they want to save the planet from man-made climate change and other imaginary disasters. Their hatred of biotech crops is intense and well documented. But they even despise hybrid seeds and golden rice. They want modern herbicides and insecticides banned in favor of what they call natural or organic alternatives, some of which are actually highly toxic to bees, animals, and people, some of which are actually synthetic and not natural, neurotoxic pyrethrins, for example, and most of which are rarely tested either for residues on produce or for possibly long-term toxicity to humans. These ideologues demand natural fertilizers, which often provide a tiny fraction of the nutrients that modern synthetic fertilizers do, and which are often made from cattle or chicken feces that might then be mixed with animal urine, sawdust, and other waste materials. This kind of fertilizer can harbor viruses, heavy metals, and antibiotic-resistant bacteria, all of which can be dangerous to people and livestock. Getting rid of modern fertilizers also assumes we're going to get those feces from cattle, sheep, chickens, and other livestock, all of which the ideologues want to banish. It assumes we'll happily surrender to their other outrageous demands and start eating bugs and spirulina algae instead of steak and lobster. They want America to return to more earth-friendly and traditional farming. They want impoverished and malnourished African, Asian, and Latin American farmers to continue enjoying their right, so-called, to plant seeds that are culturally appropriate and practice traditional, indigenous, sustainable farming that's better described as antiquated, backbreaking subsistence farming. They call this food sovereignty, the right to culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound methods in accord with ethical agroecology principles. In other words, millions of parents and children doing stoop labor from dawn till dusk. Tractors? Why tractors? Why not horses, oxen, and More human labor, they insist. Well, heck, if they want to keep billions of people gainfully and traditionally employed, why not borrow a page from Milton Friedman's comment to his Asian guides and hosts back in the 1960s and give these folks teaspoons and hand trowels to take care of the soil work? Well, they say we should at least get rid of gasoline and diesel tractors and switch to electric models. Never mind that EV tractors and combines would have to be simply gigantic and would require several tons of battery modules. And they still wouldn't be able to do a full day's work without hours-long recharges from weather-dependent wind and solar installations that would provide electricity when it's available instead of when the farmers need it. And don't forget, during harvesting time and planting season, especially if there's incoming inclement weather, they need these tractors almost 24/7 for days on end. You're not going to get that with any EV variety. Never mind also that these batteries are the product of child and slave labor at thousands of foreign mines, processing plants, and factories, accompanied by oceans of toxic pollutants that poison land, air, water, wildlife, croplands, and people. But of course, that's all happening in some faraway country, out of sight and out of mind. So the activists don't really care about that, but we should. They also demand that oil and gas be locked in the ground. They say we don't need petrochemical products, especially synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. I wonder if these folks have ever looked at their own clothing, food, homes, offices, or world around them. Synthetic fabrics, cosmetics, cell phone and computer housings, paints and pharmaceuticals, tapes and adhesives, protective gear, eyeglasses, car bodies, detergents, wind turbine blades and nacelle covers, medical devices of every description. Practically everything around them and in their lives exists because of oil, gas, and petrochemicals. They don't seem to care. They don't even think about it. They just assume all these things are going to somehow always be there. But they say we can just use biofuels to replace the feedstocks for products we really need. Sure, and they will get to tell us what products we really need. But more importantly, banishing oil, gas, petrochemicals, and internal combustion engines would certainly mean we no longer need the ethanol as a gasoline additive. And that would eliminate the need to grow corn on 36,000 acres. That's equivalent to the entire state of Iowa, that we're now planting in corn for ethanol. And that's not an exaggeration. That's actually the amount of land we're planting every year for corn just to produce ethanol. That land, they say, could be once again used for food crops or wildlife habitat, except it won't be. Organic farms, first of all, have significantly lower crop yields per acre and require far more land than conventional agriculture. And worse, ending oil and gas production means tens or even hundreds of millions of acres would have to be planted with biofuel crops to provide feedstocks for the thousands of currently petrochemical products. And that land is going to be marginal farmland or current wildlife habitat for the most part. It also means vastly more tractors and human labor and more land, water, fertilizers, and pesticides to harvest and to cultivate and harvest and process sugar and oilseed crops and algae. And then all those simple biofuel molecules would have to be transformed into much more complex hydrocarbons to provide the necessary feedstocks. That would require even more energy from even more wind turbines and solar panels on top of tripling or even quadrupling our existing electricity needs to transform the US and global economies to all electric systems and repeatedly recharge vehicle, grid balancing, and power backup batteries that those systems would require. Perhaps, though, Team Biden and the climate and agriculture ideologues plan to import all these petrochemicals and products as they seem to intend with regard to wind turbines, solar panels, battery modules, transformers, and other green energy equipment. And that's simply because America will not be able to produce any of it, because Team Biden and its allies oppose mining and drilling here in the United States, even for raw materials that are essential for their utopian renewable energy transformation. It's because we won't have affordable, reliable electricity even to operate factories. So I wonder, how can these best and brightest decision makers and advisors be so ignorant, inept, and clueless, so unable to connect even 2 or 3 dots? They would destroy our scenic vistas, habitats, and wildlife to save the earth from a computer-modeled climate crisis that President Biden absurdly claims is a greater threat than nuclear war. We get other luminaries like John Kerry, the climate envoy, pontificating, "I refuse to call it climate change anymore. It's not change, it's a crisis, and we can't get to net zero unless agriculture is front and center as part of the solution. Agriculture must slash its carbon and methane emissions by culling livestock and curtailing the use of man-made fertilizers." Remember, a warmer planet with more atmospheric CO2 is going to grow more plants with less water and feed more animals and people. But President Biden and Mr. Kerry seem to be just too ideologically hidebound and blinded to see this. And I guess that means we return to the basic rule that it's really not about the climate. It's about control of our lives and our livelihoods and living standards. These so-called activists base critical policies that disrupt and hammer livelihoods and lives everywhere on childish beliefs in Santa Claus and Harry Potter. They think we can banish today's energy and agricultural resources and technologies, and amazing replacements for them will just be here somehow via some mythical process that's called materials acquisition for government-mandated infrastructure and industrial change. The acronym, of course, is MAGIC, or MAGIC. And magic is just an illusion, a Hollywood special effects. It's not reality. Put another way, they think they can pile one law and mandate, one meaningless, impossible promise on top of another, one scam and subsidy on top of another, one complicated program on top of another, and it will create an energy and agricultural utopia. It reminds me of the Red Queen and what she told Alice. "You just haven't had much practice, my dear. Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." Of course, some of them know very well that their schemes cannot possibly work, but they promote the policies anyway. They seem to believe that in the end, if their schemes don't work, they can just mandate that we commoners and serfs and peasants must learn to get by under 1930s era living standards in 700 square foot apartments, using electricity when Mother Nature makes it available, subsisting on beetle burgers and larvae milk. They tell us, "You will eat bugs and be happy. Don't thrive or fly and be happy. Freeze all winter and swelter all summer and be happy." That's us, not them, of course. And they think Africa would be the perfect laboratory for testing new foods, like crackers, muffins, meatloaves, and sausages that are made from lake flies. And that is a real proposal. I'm kidding you not. If all that fails, they'll just impose food rationing. Even more insane and insidious, these policies and agendas have the financial backing of far-left foundations like the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. And collectively, those outfits have committed seemingly endless billions of dollars to NGOs like Greenpeace, Food and Water Watch. Pesticide Action Network, Sierra Club, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and a lot of pressure groups that few of you have ever even heard of, like La Via Campesina, the Peasant Way. Banks and investment firms are playing the same games, using other people's money, your money, my money, our pension funds' money, to push wokenista, leftist, progressive ideologies and policies. And still worse, they also have the financial backing and government clout of the USAID, World Bank, multiple UN agencies like the Food and Agriculture Organization, and even at times the Africa Development Bank. These organizations are employing taxpayer money to host international conferences, drive policies and laws and treaties, and support supposedly sustainable farming and culturally appropriate food. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has enlisted virtually every single federal agency and their progressive, more than willing civil servants to promote and impose this destructive, lethal climate and agricultural agenda in the United States and globally. These UN and US government agencies are even demanding adherence to ultra-organic practices as a condition for people in communities receiving taxpayer funding for agricultural development programs in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Others would go even further than all of this. Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, advocated de-development of the United States and other overdeveloped countries, as he called them, and semi-development of the underdeveloped countries so that we all approach decent and ecologically sustainable standards of living for everyone. Lead oceanographer Jacques Cousteau told a French magazine interviewer, in order to stabilize world populations, we must eliminate 350,000 people per day. And that was in 1991 when the global population was just 5.4 billion. It suggests that we would have to eliminate 525,000 people per day now, in order to stabilize populations. But as Joe Limekugler pointed out this morning, we're seeing a consistent downward trend in population growth. So that may take care of itself. But in any event, environmental defense scientist Charles Worster stated that people are the cause of all the problems. We need to get rid of some of them, and banning DDT is as good a way as any, he said. So is starvation, of course, as Stalin and Mao so ably demonstrated. A lot of these activists prefer to call their policies environmental, climate, and social and racial justice. And it reminds me of Humpty Dumpty. When I use a word, he told Alice, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. And the only question is, who is to be master? That's all. In the real world, campaigns, policies, and government actions to eradicate fossil fuels and modern agricultural practices and technologies go well beyond callous and imperious. They go well beyond eco-imperialism, the title of my book. They go well beyond eco-colonialism and eco-apartheid. The activists pushing them are basically anarchists. They're very good at destroying what we have, what works, and leaving disorder and mayhem in their wake. They're not very good at devising feasible plans for what will replace our energy systems, agricultural technologies, and industrialized civilizations. And in fact, they're driving eco-manslaughter at global scales via energy, farming, and climate policy. They're imposing systematic racism and death on people. To help ensure they'll succeed, as all of you know, they're going well into our schools and other systems, our social systems, our entertainment, indoctrinating young people with their horrific ideas. You just have to look at the K through 12 and college and postgraduate academic institutions, at what passes today for journalism, and the inhabitants of the deep state regulatory swamps that are out there. But thankfully, on a more optimistic tone like Jay Lair would want, amid all this horror movie insanity, anarchy, civilizational destruction, and needless death, there's some good news. There's increasing pushback by my organization, CFACT, and other groups, parents and politicians who are educating, promoting people and planet solutions, and using legal and other actions to stall and stymie these lethal programs. That pushback is inspiring new laws, like what Utah's legislature and governor just enacted. That legislation makes it clear that Utah has a duty and the sovereign authority to defend its essential electricity generation systems from any external regulatory interference. And it therefore requires at least 180 days notification prior to any proposed decommissioning, disposal, retirement, or closure of any coal, natural gas, nuclear, or hydroelectric electricity generation facilities and equipment in the state. It requires that whether the closure was proposed by a utility company or is being forced on the state or utility by federal mandates, or simply by the high costs of complying with increasingly stringent federal dictates. The pushback is inspiring lawsuits by CFAC, the Center for American Liberty, Save the Whales groups, the Center for the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and other organizations and companies to delay, block, or bankrupt massive wind and solar projects in, I skipped a slide, I'm sorry, in people's backyards. And it's supporting an increasing amount of pushback by developing nations. And under that, I would include China and India. They have made it clear that they will not be bound by any Paris climate treaty, fossil fuel or carbon emission dictates. Instead, they see the treaty, they see the treaty as a possible aspiration for emission reductions and actually workable alternative energy probably decades from now. Right now, they also view it as an avenue for demanding trillions of dollars annually in climate reparations and mitigation, extracted from still developed countries that are supposed to somehow de-develop, de-industrialize, and impoverish themselves and still come up with all that money. Trillions of dollars every single year. That highway robbery is obviously, or certainly at least hopefully, dead on arrival. It's an impossibility that will do little other than make people and countries realize how insane and dictatorial all of this has become. In fact, I think this realization is already upon us. Farmers and families in countries all over the world are increasingly angry, frustrated, and fed up. Brits, Germans, and other Europeans are already paying 2 or 3 or even 4 times what average Americans do right now for gasoline, natural gas, and electricity. They can't afford it. Businesses are closing. People are freezing jobless in the dark. Thousands are needlessly dying each winter simply because they can't keep their homes warm enough to survive illnesses and health problems that they'd normally get through just fine. They are not happy, and they will not be happy. They're demanding an end to net zero across Europe. Sri Lanka's last president wanted to get climate kudos, I would suppose you'd call them, for banning chemical fertilizers and pesticides. His country's food yields plummeted, people were going hungry, fights were breaking out over scarce food. The president was forced to flee the country before he was jailed or even worse, and his bans were quickly reversed when he was gone. Dutch farmers were ordered to stop using modern fertilizers and even dismantle their farms. They got angry, got organized, staged tractor protests across highways and roads and towns, and won a BBB party majority in the Netherlands Senate. Things are changing. after their government told them to kill 65,000 dairy cows per year for the next 3 years. Irish farmers took inspiration from the Dutch. They formed an alliance to challenge incumbents in next year's elections. Poland and other former Eastern Bloc countries are simply refusing to knuckle under to Brussels and EU climate and fossil fuel dictates. They're pushing forward with their own plans. Urban centers obviously need enormous amounts of electricity. New York alone would need some 2,500 12-megawatt offshore wind turbines towering over 800 feet above the waves just to provide enough electricity to power the state on a hot summer day, and that's assuming the wind is blowing. Alternatively, it would need 14,000 2-megawatt onshore turbines. That's nearly 20% of all the wind turbines the entire United States has installed to date. Most of the electricity, of course, would go to New York City, but the residents there have no room for wind turbines or solar panels. And for sure, they don't want those contraptions in their backyards or along their beaches. So those thousands of wind turbines and millions of solar panels would go in rural New Yorkers' backyards. And those folks, quite simply, don't want their scenic vistas, transmission lines, and croplands and wildlife habitats blanketed with turbines, transformers, wind turbines, solar panels, transmission lines, and literally thousands of ginormous fire-prone battery modules. And of course, it's not just rural New Yorkers. All across America, these monstrous projects are generating the same outrage, opposition, and pushback. Poor and middle-class Americans don't want and can't afford electric cars and trucks. They certainly don't want those vehicles catching fire in their garages. They don't want to be forced to replace their gas stoves and furnaces and water heaters with electric models that will cost 2 or 3 times more to operate and will function under this widespread solar and wind system only when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. So they too are repelling. They're suing, delaying, blocking, and bankrupting these edicts and projects, using the same laws and tactics that rabid environmentalists have employed for decades. They're starting to throw these dictatorial net zero agendas into disarray. Also promising, there's increasing pushback on these issues, including environment, social governance, or ESG programs by Republican state attorneys general. State AGs have begun launching investigations and lawsuits against investment firms, insurance companies, banks, other kinds of companies, and their climate alliances. They accurately label these practices collusion, consumer fraud, stifling of competition, violations of state and federal antitrust laws, violations of fiduciary duty, misleading investors on vital material facts about energy and climate policy and change in prospectuses and other documents. As Florida Governor Ron DeSantis put it, these are policies that could not win at the ballot box. So these folks are trying to do through corporate America what they can't do in the electoral process. Who do these people think they are? DeSantis asks. Do they think they govern our society? Nobody voted for BlackRock CEO Larry Fink. So our mantra in Florida is no economic or social transformation without representation. Faced with threats recently of such kinds of legal actions, 18 out of 30 big insurance companies exited the UN's Net Zero Insurance Alliance. Now, why the UN is setting up these kinds of alliances instead of simply studying the effects of climate change and the causes of climate change, both man-made and natural, I don't understand. But those original members of the alliance controlled a huge amount of money, over $3 trillion in assets, and 18 of them have bailed out. the others are thinking about doing likewise. And more lawsuits are likely to follow. Banks and investment firms playing the ESG game could and should be next. This all got me thinking. Maybe another even better and certainly more interesting and long-lasting solution would be to send woke, climate-obsessed bureaucrats, CEOs, journalists, and Bud Light marketing teams to energy and agricultural education camps. And they could build their own huts, grow their own food, weave their own cotton and linen garments, and learn to survive in the fossil fuel and organic utopia that they want to impose on all of us. After all, as billionaire Michael Bloomberg opined recently, farming is easy. You just dig a hole, you put the seed in it, you put dirt on top, add water, and up comes the corn. So there's hope. After this eye-opening experience that they might have, or at least contemplate, as economist Herb Stein once pointed out, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. I think we're approaching that point in history, but we'll reach it only if we in this room and across America and the world continue working to make it happen. We're driving for the go-ahead score with seconds to go in this gridiron battle for our living standards, children, and civilization. We dare not let up before the final seconds tick away, and we have won for ourselves and our children. Thank you. So I think we have some time for questions, and if anyone has comments or points or things they'd like to add to what I've said or corrections for me, I'd love to hear them all.
Please come up to this mic if you would.
Thank you very much. Could you comment on the concept of the 15-minute cities as it fits into the control mechanism of what the WEF is coming up with?
15-minute cities?
Where you can, that's how you live.
Where you're 15 minutes away from everything?
Right, and then, so you can't have a car and...
Yeah, you're going to bike or walk or take public transportation. It also means you're going to be living in high-rises. And for me, this not only takes away... Is it not working? Oh. Okay. Let's see if it's falling off here. Yeah, too many things in my ear. Not only does this take away our personal freedoms to choose where and how we want to live, but it also means that if there's another pandemic like COVID, it's going to spread like wildfire through those high-rise apartments and schools, everything jammed together in little metro areas. Maybe that's their endpoint goal, I don't know. But I certainly would not support that or almost anything else they propose because they don't think anything through, or if they do, it's for pretty much evil purposes. Anybody else? Jim?
Yes, thank you for giving a very clear and important presentation. What I would like to suggest is that you approach different government bodies with this presentation, and specifically the city of Los Angeles seems to have, with all the homeless, the crime, the expensive living conditions, they seem to have time to make energy policy, which is basically along the lines of what you're warning against. And I happen to live in the district of the city councilwoman who's in charge of the Energy and Environment Committee, and I think you could make a case by writing and sending this information. It would add to my meager efforts because this is agenda that is got to be stopped, and we're having California is becoming a prime example of how far off a state can go. And so that's a suggestion. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And in fact, my organization has banded together with several others and brought people together from California through New York City to form the Net Zero Reality Coalition. And we've been talking initially about batteries and what those would cost in order to fully back up a wind and solar-based electricity system. And you're talking anywhere from $5 trillion to $80 trillion for the United States for the first generation of batteries sufficient to do all of this. And that doesn't include the maintenance and the replacement that would follow on. It doesn't include the disposal of all of those. And most of those batteries, as have been pointed out, are going to be coming from China, which puts us at a complete disadvantage to China for our entire economy, our defense structure, our basic living standards. All of that can be cut off at a moment's notice. That makes no sense whatsoever. So we've been going up to Capitol Hill and making presentations and talking to members of Congress. So far it's been just Republican members because the Democrats up to now have not wanted to talk to us. But that may change, and I think your idea of reaching out to some of the local legislators is a good one too, especially if somebody's just got a bit of an open mind to think about this stuff.
Well, I think the COVID situation has opened up possibilities, and the city council in Los Angeles does a lot of things by Zoom or just phoning in. So that's a way that you could not have to appear physically, but could still make a very important point.
Yeah, and if you've got some names and email addresses and so forth,
Yep.
please share them. And that's for
I
all
will.
of you folks out
I
here.
will.
We've got to find ways to reach these people. I will make my talk available, and I'm happy to have it shared with people in your backyards, your friends, your legislators, school boards, and so forth, because we have to start opening eyes and opening minds to all of these realities.
Yeah, as you point out, this eco-imperialist agenda, denying technology for real development to the third world, is manifestly racist, as is, frankly, the entire program of more broadly attempting to increase the cost of fuel and electricity, because it's simply a regressive tax. And so, in your view, I mean, a lot of people on the left are not, in fact, racists. They do not conceive of themselves as being racist. They conceive of themselves as people who are for, racial justice and so forth. Why is it that they are so oblivious to the actual consequences of the policies that they are saying?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. I think they don't dare admit to themselves what they're actually doing out there. And they really get focused on saving the planet from something that they have convinced themselves is a real threat. So they don't want to be looking at the little kids in cobalt mines, artisanal cobalt mines in Democratic Republic of Congo. They don't want to be looking at the solar slaves in China, the Uyghurs. They don't want to be looking at the way that people are being forced to work in these filthy plants that have no standards for safety or pollution control, whether they're mineral processing plants or factories in China and many other places, because to do so forces them to admit that what they're doing is destroying millions of lives in the name of saving the planet from something that's really not happening. Other than that, I'm at a loss. And even up on Capitol Hill, you can't get somebody like Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island to focus on any of this or to let you finish a statement before he cuts you off. He doesn't want any of these points brought out in a public hearing if he's the chairman of the committee and can gavel you down.
And then the other side of this is, why is it, in your view, that for the most part, conservatives have been unwilling to label this as racist?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not unwilling. I hope folks in here aren't unwilling to do so. We've had the racism thing thrown in our faces for years as Republicans or conservatives, and even reminding the Democrats that they were the party of slavery, the Confederacy, the Ku Klux Klan, the lynchings and so forth, the schoolhouse doors being closed, the ballot, the voting violations and requirements to pass a literacy test before you could vote. They don't like being reminded of that, and I don't know why more of us are not willing to remind them of that. So,
Thank you.
we should do it.
Yeah, thank you. My name is George Isayu, MD. Oh, got it. Thank you, Jared. George Isayu, MD. And I just need to introduce this question so it's properly understood. Of course, all these policies are, in many countries in the world, are promoted by the globalist agenda, whatever it is. We don't need to redefine it because you know exactly what it is. But I'm asking this question from my point of view. I was at a very high levels of organization of the Catholic Medical Association in the United States, and I was vice president of the International Catholic Medical Association. And we worked for many years very close with the Vatican under Pope John Paul II to promote the right kind of medical ethics throughout the world and the right kind of public health ethics and so forth. Now, I am personally convinced, as well as obviously other people, that under the new Vatican reality under Pope Francis, some very bad things have happened, and that he's gone along completely with this globalist agenda. And the question is actually, it seems to me that they wouldn't have not been so successful if it wasn't for the fact that they finally got the Catholic Church on their side. Now, can you comment on that and the importance of that?
Yeah, up to a point I can. Pope Francis is from a segment of the Catholic Church that's always been very involved in these social causes, socialist social causes, and he's been a strong believer in climate change and getting rid of fossil fuels. He hasn't budged on any of that. He surrounds himself with people that think like he does, so he's not getting the countervailing points of view. But you're right, having the Catholic Church siding with the World Economic Forum and President Biden, the UN, the billionaires like Bill Gates and Michael Bloomberg and so forth who are pouring money into this, all of whom expect to get much richer, although I don't understand why they need to be richer than they already are. And the corporate people that want to buy into this system so that they can do the rent seeking and get the subsidies and so forth. Even if whatever they're doing fails ultimately, they won't be held accountable in any meaningful way. But in the meantime, they can rake in all kinds of money and have their companies grow and prosper at the expense of a lot of us. It's a mystery to me. I don't really understand why any of this is happening, why we've allowed it to happen. But we're up against the 8 ball right now, and we're going to have to fight back a lot harder than we have been. Thanks.